for tomorrow. Hey, Fred, I heard your voice. Are we ready to get going?
It sure looks like it to me, Joe. I see a very large list of participants logged in. So just want to appreciate everyone's attendance and participation today, and want to get it started with San Diego's material and elements of the workshop.
All right, thanks a lot. Thanks, Fred. Again, this is Joe McCauley. You see, this is what I don't want to happen. Was I videoing? Stop video. Am I? Okay, I am showing. Okay, this is Joe McCauley. Appreciate everyone for being part of today's workshop. This is the third of 5 workshops that we have scheduled after receiving feedback from stakeholders on additional topics they would like to hear. We had one already with regards to SoCal gas, high cost mitigations that focused on the high pressure, medium pressure, and storage risks. We had one last week focusing on wildfire with the focus on questions that Turn had submitted. Today, as you can see here, is still wildfire, focusing on questions that CalPAO had submitted. 1 to 3 o'clock, the last couple ran a little over, which is fine. We want to try to answer as many questions as we can during today's workshop. On a high level, I sent to the service list, I think, an email this morning that had 3 spreadsheets. 2 of them are the wildfire, what we refer to as the wildfire supplemental work papers, also a wings related work paper. That email also included this presentation, just 2 slides, and that email also included the document. It was a PDF, I believe, submitted by CalPAO with suggested topics that we use for this workshop. I summarized them on this slide. I provided the full PDF as part of my attachment so people can see the questions in more detail. And the idea is we will be going over those questions, answering those questions today, and then making sure we understand them correctly, understanding them or describing the answers in a manner that is understandable. And then again, with the focus on CalPAO question, answering those questions, and then to the extent other parties have follow-up questions, certainly answer those as well. Again, on a high level, the types of questions that CalPAO had identified had to do with the wings modeling, some questions on the grid hardening plans, underground versus overhead. Wings modeling and work paper. So we anticipate sharing that on our screen, if you will. Question with regards to the basis for identified planned funding request. I think their actual paper had funding ramp. We are not requesting funding. We are identifying what we anticipate to request. So I added the word planned, if you will, basis for identified planned funding requests. They had a question on battery powered generators versus system hardening initiatives. I think that's a PSPS related question. Long-term plans for PSPS, 2021 progress in 2021 on completing various identified mitigations. Again, in that document, they had those specific mitigations identified. Data regarding PSPS impacts to customers, use of relay settings to mitigate wildfires, PSPS notifications, a question on that. And then they had a couple questions with regards to the RSE calculations for the wildfire mitigations. On a high level, as I said, those are the questions that CalPAO had submitted. We definitely appreciate it. And that is all I have to say. Are there any questions from stakeholders? Certainly, maybe Chris from CalPAO or others before we get started? If not, again, I don't know. Yeah.
Sorry, this is Chris. Hey, yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I was just going to make a couple of notes, and I'm trying to wrestle with, I don't think my video is coming through right now, but I'll try and fix that. I think I got another video window open somewhere. But anyway, yeah, I appreciate this, and I appreciate you were highlighting that it's not funding. You're going to explain the costs. I appreciate that. One just quick housekeeping thing. We also received the email on the data request. I think you shared, or someone shared, maybe it was you. It included the integral engineering report. As far as I can tell, it's kind of like a snippet of the integral, which had to do, that's not really something I think that we're planning to talk about today, but just, is the full report available? Because I think that captured a portion of it, if I understood it right.
You're correct. The section that we provided, again, during the last workshop, I think it was Fred had a question about a certain data value, and we mentioned the data source was that report. And so folks asked for a copy of it. The section that we provided is the section specific to that report, to those data values. The rest of the report is not applicable to the question. And so we did not provide it. We provided the portion of the report that was specifically applicable to that data point.
Okay. Well, so could we request it, or do you need us to write, a data request for it, or?
Well, what we can do is we can review to see if other aspects of that report were used for as a source of data. If not, there's really no need to be, it has no relevance, the other sections have no relevance to RAMP. So it would really be, I think, we can, if you're interested in it, we will discuss it. I'm not here to say that, no, we're not going to provide it, but to the extent the rest of the report was not used as a data source for anything in RAMP, it really isn't applicable to RAMP.
Yeah, so I mean,
So,
I guess I had kind of thought I thought that the ask was for the report. That's what we were expecting to see, because that provides everything, and it also puts everything in context and everything. So anyway, yeah, we'd like to request the full report.
all right, noted, and we'll follow up on that.
Okay, super. And then just as a point of reference, so I'm Chris Parks. I'm with Cal Advocates, and just I know that Cal Advocates has gone through a number of name changes. At one point, I think it was Division of Ratepayer Advocates, and it was ORA, Office of Ratepayer Advocates. So what in our comments, if people see our comments across the docket board, it always begins with an introduction as it's the Public Advocates Office. That's what Public Advocates Office is designated, I believe, at some level in the state as a state agent, as a state entity. And then when we file comments, we go by Cal Advocates. So just to make it, add another little thing to that. But when we file our comments, you'll see that we'll introduce it with Public Advocates Office, and then Cal Advocates recommends this, or Cal Advocates notes this, or something like that. We don't go by Cal PAO because I believe there is some other organization within the state that may use that PAO acronym. So it just kind of caught my attention because I saw it on your slide. So I didn't mean to highlight that, but I thought, well, what the heck, I'll just kind of give that little background there. But thank you, and thank you for creating this agenda. And I think you also shared our exact list of questions that we had asked to be discussed, or topics to walk through. So I'll be looking at that too. So, but thank you very much.
Sure. Yep. Guilty as charged. Using the shorter version.
Common. It's common.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? And then just for clarity for those who are on the call, since this is a wildfire focused chapter, the report that we provided the other day was a follow-up to a SoCalGas storage risk the workshop we had discussed SoCalGas storage risks, and it was one of the mitigations within the SoCalGas storage risk. So again, those of you that are here specifically for wildfire, and you're hearing us refer to a report that we provided as a follow-up to a data request, that was not a wildfire related issue. Just providing that background for others. If nothing else, then I'd like to hand it over to my team. We're going to have Sarah Christine, and Sean talking today. We looked at the questions, Chris, that you had provided, and we thought sort of divvy them up so everybody gets a chance to talk, and then at the same time gives folks a chance to get a breather while somebody else may be answering a question. And I think I even answered one of the questions. So if the team is ready, Sarah, were you going to share your screen?
Yeah, I'm gonna share my screen. I have a couple of things here already ready to open just to help us navigate. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Give me a second here. And let me know if you can see it. I need to move some things around.
Yes.
Okay, great. So what you're looking at on the screen is the document we got from, is it Cal Advocates? Because I did
Yes.
confuse myself with a different name, so I appreciate the clarification. Thank you, Chris. So these are the questions we got from Cal Advocates. The first one is specific to pipeline risk. So really our conversation starts with part B, where it says wildfire topics. So we'll walk through these today. And then one thing we added to the agenda, Chris, is advanced protection based on the questions you raised last week. So we'll start with these questions and then at the end talk about advanced protection, unless you have another suggestion for the order in which you want to tackle these.
That sounds great. Thank you.
Awesome. All right, so the first question took a screenshot or an image from a presentation that we provided at a PSPS public briefing that the commission hosted for the different utilities. So this is not necessarily something we provided in RAMP, but part of it is relevant to RAMP, especially for the RAMP years, 2022 through 2024. So when we get to the nitty-gritty details of the questions, I'll be navigating through our RAMP work papers where you can find the information that is being asked. And then obviously if there's any follow-up questions, we'll be happy to clarify as we go. So the first question is asking the average and range of cost per mile for each of the mitigations shown here. So we're looking at bare wire hardening, covered conductor, and underground. And the best places to gather this information, there's not necessarily one place where you can go for the cost per mile, but we do have two key tables that can help provide that information. So going to our RAMP chapter, at the very end of the chapter, we have two tables, Table 10 and Table 11. Table 10 provides the forecasted dollars for 2022 through 2024 for all the mitigations we included in the RAMP, and Table 11 includes the units, the range of units that we're proposing for each of those mitigations. So to answer the question specifically for the bare wire, we can scroll down this table, I believe. It's going to be at the bottom here. Right there. So for future years, in the past, this is our traditional hardening program. Essentially, in the past, we've implemented it in different tiers across our system. But for the 2022 through 2024 timeframe of the RAMP, the remaining 5 miles, roughly 5 miles that we're going to implement are all in Tier 3. And what this table shows is if you look at the forecasted dollars, where you want to look at is really these numbers right here, these 4 columns over here. So for the bare conductor, we've got a range, low and high. So 4.5 million to 5.5 million. And if you take the average of that, it's roughly, the midpoint is about 5 million in total. And then if you look at so that gives us the total cost of average 5 million for bare conductor. If we move over to table 11, we can look at the units in a similar fashion. So I'm just going to scroll down here. And there we go. This is the same mitigation. We've got 5 to 6 miles. So if you take the average, that's about 5.5 miles. And to get the cost per mile estimate, close estimate to all the numbers that we're using, you would then just divide the total cost by the total mileage to get a number that's close to 1 million a mile for bare conductor. Let me pause here and just make sure that that's clear before I go through the other two. It's going to be the similar type of analysis, and I can maybe just give you the overall numbers, but at least you'll understand how you can walk through these two tables.
Thank you, Sarah. So, so to understand what you're displaying, make sure I understand this correctly. On this row, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 down. Overhead, yeah, thank you. So it's tier 3 and tier 2 on the different rows, and with the recorded units,
Chris, I'm sorry to interrupt. Sarah, just so you know, the way you're sharing the screen, you're getting messages that are showing to the group as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, Chris.
No problem. So it shows recorded units were 42, and I take it that that's 42 miles in 2020. And then forecast for the range for forecast for 2022 to 2024 is 5 to 6 miles. And so you're saying that without going back to the other one, if you divide that previous dollar figure by this, you come up with about $1 million per mile of overhead conductor, bare conductor hardening. Is that right?
That's correct. And I'm doing some rounding up, but that's a rough estimate of that overall number.
Okay, and can you, and then a couple of questions on this topic. The bare wire hardening, can you explain what that includes?
Sure. So this is a remainder of what used to be known as the prime and firm programs. And what those programs did is they targeted specific assets that were deemed to be at risk based on specific characteristics. So for example, in the firm program, we were targeting small copper wire that we knew was more prone to having wire down incidents. And based on the location in the HFTD and the consequences tied to those locations, we basically identified a list of conductors that we needed to prioritize replacements for. And then also similarly for the prime model, we looked at potential pole loading issues and prioritized poles to be replaced across the system. And so that program has been ongoing for years. And because of the shift to more advanced hardening solutions such as covered conductor and undergrounding, we kind of ramped down the traditional hardening to look at more holistic solutions that not just target assets in kind of a random fashion, but rather looking at a segment end to end from a SCADA device to a SCADA device so that we can also target PSPS reduction. So the 5 miles really carries over from prior targets, but it's sort of a transition towards the ramp up in covered conductor and undergrounding.
So would you say that there were, prior to this shift, were there circuits or segments of circuits that would have been targeted for this bare conductor wire hardening that has now been shifted over? They were previously under the old program. Now they're under a new program where instead of that hardening, it's going to be covered conductor?
Correct. Yes, there were many instances where we already had some things kind of in early scoping stages for bare conductor hardening that we decided to shift over to covered conductor based on our new modeling efforts, for example.
Okay.
Yeah.
And is that bare conductor modeling, is that bare conductor that was identified, I guess, prioritized for hardening, is that mostly all number 6 copper, or is it a percentage of that and something else, or Do you know?
I'll let the team chime in. Maybe Jonathan or Sean can help me out, but roughly speaking, it was number 4 and number 6, I think. That was one critical component of that, but then there was also looking at the consequence. So not necessarily prioritizing every single one of those wires. We were really looking at where they are located and the potential of igniting a significant fire based on their location. If it's some wire in the middle of nowhere and there's no vegetation, maybe that would have been a lower priority than smaller wire in heavily vegetated areas, just as an example. Generally speaking, those are the 2 categories, but I'll pause and let Sean and Jonathan maybe chime in.
Hey, Sarah. No, I think you have it right. It was mostly prioritized by the conductor type. And yes, we were targeting the small copper conductor that was known to fail, which is mostly the number 4, number 6.
Thanks, Sean. And so, and the reason why this is under this WINGS program is because is this number, you have a higher incident of this type gauge of coming down, a higher frequency, likelihood of failure. Why are these conductors targeted for this old and then the new program?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think
so
you nailed it. The risk of failure was found to be higher based on our experience with those types of conductor.
And this failure, is this typically like the wire down? I mean, I think in WMPs, utilities report wires down, I think, as one of the data points or metrics. Is that the failure, wire down, or is it something else?
Yeah, conductor failure typically can lead to a wire down. It might not be a full wire down, right? The conductor can fail and lay on top of something else or break something. But yeah, a wire down is what we're trying to avoid with conductor failure.
Okay, and is there a certain circuit type or circuit configuration or something else that is targeted for this type of mitigation?
No, it's not a circuit type. As Sarah mentioned, it has more to do with the risk of failure, which we tied back to those specific conductor types, and then the consequence of that failure, which how likely would it be that there would be a wildfire event should an incident occur in those areas.
Okay, and is this wire gauge that we're talking about typically found on 12 kV, 13 kV primary systems, or is it found somewhere else that you're targeting for this?
Our distribution system is almost exclusively 12 kV, so that's what we're looking at. We do have some small pockets of 4 kV as well that could be included in the scoping for that.
Okay, and the risk for this wires down is that this then becomes like an energized source of fire ignition. Ignition, is that the reason why
Correct.
this is
Yeah.
targeted? Okay, and do you have any I mean, I can understand that there's maybe different circuit factors that can weigh into whether this kind of event will ignite, cause an ignition, or else ignite and maybe lead to a wildfire. Are there other factors that are relevant to this? I mean, so we know number 6 copper, number 4 wire, is that ACSR or something like that for the number 4?
Number 4, number 6 were specifically copper conductor, all copper, not ACSR.
Oh, okay. Are there other factors that weigh in terms of this type of event causing or leading to an ignition, other than the fact that it's this gauge of wire? I mean, I mentioned voltage, but they're all the same voltage. Are there, well, except for the 4 kV, but are there other factors like circuit configuration, relay settings, switching, SCADA even, or detection circuits? Are there other things that factor into, you know, how great a risk or how great that this kind of event is in terms of leading to a wildfire or an ignition?
So for this particular risk driver and what we were targeting there, the circuit configuration and those sorts of things were not included, right? We're looking at the things that are within our control and easier to change, which is things like reconductoring. So no, I can't think of other factors that would you know, go into why we would choose certain sections of that type of wire versus others. We treated them all essentially the same, you know, minus the consequence part, meaning is it located in tier 3 or tier 2, those sorts of things. But no, the configuration, all those other things become much harder to predict and can sometimes be out of our control. So we mostly just focused on the type of wire.
Okay, and this hardening, you mentioned reconductor. Is this hardening? I mean, is this hardening basically reconductoring, or is it? I mean, and maybe replacing poles, or what is this hardening? What is it in terms of, you know, what is it?
Yeah, so the original intent is to replace that conductor, but we don't just stop there. So as we're going through that area, we are bringing the area up to our current standards and designing the poles and the conductor for the known local conditions in that area, meaning we're designing it to withstand the wind speeds known to be seen in that area. So that sort of thing could include, you know, the wood poles being replaced with steel poles. You might have some taller steel poles, depending on the loading calculations, and you will very likely see increased phase spacing on the new configuration versus the old configuration.
Thanks, that's very helpful. If you were using the new program of covered conductor or insulated conductor, whatever you want to call it, you would probably more likely than not be replacing the poles as well. Is that fair to say because of the added weight of the covered conductor?
That's fair. It does depend. We do the calculations to make sure we're not replacing things we don't need to. If there are existing steel poles in the area that can support the weight of the covered conductor, we will leave them in place, assuming they pass our loading calculations. But yes, if there's older poles that were not designed for that, it is very likely that they'll be replaced.
And then for the bare conductor replacement, can you give me a sense, like more often than not, you're also replacing the poles, or 50% of the time you're replacing the poles, or do you have a rough, can you give me a sense of that?
Yeah, I would say when it's our current standard is to use steel poles in the HFTD. So more often than not, we are replacing the wood poles with steel poles inside, you know, as part of the program.
Okay, so on this page, it shows like, you know, a range of 5 to 6 units. And then I think we came up with $1 million using the previous table. Is that in terms of like costing and that kind of stuff for this mitigation, is that considered mostly a capital expense or a capital and a capital cost? Is it also an expense, or is there a mixture, or how does this all get?
All three of our hardening programs have both capital and O&M components. They are give or take 98% capital and 2% O&M. There's always some associated O&M costs with these hardening projects.
Okay. And if we go back to, oh, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, Chris, this is Joe. I think Sarah is trying to show the page in the ramp report where we have dollars split out by O&M and capital. And I think this was what, C, C17. Is that the one we're looking
Thank
for?
you, Joe. Yeah. And in this case, I suspect that there's no O&M because we only have 5 miles left over, and maybe the O&M was already expensed in prior years. Because the thing is,
It's just,
projects
it
can
becomes
span multiple years. Yeah.
it becomes so small at only 2% that I think it's not shown there. But you can see the small percentage there for strategic undergrounding, where it's approximately, like I said, 1% to 2%, somewhere in that range of the capital costs show up as O&M costs.
Okay, and then does this also show the, while we're here, is it nearby that we see the covered conductor? On this.
Let
on
me
this table somewhere?
navigate to that. I think it's further up. Yep, right here. C7, M2. These two.
Okay. Okay, and then we would have to go back and do some math to figure out what this cost is per mile, but maybe we'll be doing that at some point, but just, this is helpful just to kind of understand this. So it shows here that there is an O&M component for the covered conductor. It's also relatively small, I guess. But it does show up here because you're doing a lot more, a higher level of that in the forecast.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, correct.
So,
Christine just notified me that the amount for bare conductor was like it was small. It was 0.13 million. So it was relatively minor in 2022 and just wasn't shown there.
okay. And if we could go back to the table with the units on it where we had the bare conductor.
Yep. Give me just a second here. Right here.
Okay. So so it shows that in 2020 it was 42. So this is basically, and I don't know if you happen to know roughly what it might have been in 2019, if it was like on that same order of bare conductor replacement.
It was
Yeah,
in
we
that
started
same order. I don't remember the exact number, but it was on that order of 100 or so miles total across the tier 3 and tier 2.
Yeah, we started ramping down. I think in maybe late 2020, early 2021, and shifting over to the other mitigations.
Okay. And then this year, 2021, I think at the last workshop, SDG&E explained that this year, as of today, maybe they've done the covered conductor on approximately something less than 5 miles. Is that right? Okay. And just because I'm not familiar with last year, was all of that done this year, or was some of it done last year as well? I mean, a total of 5 miles of covered conductor at this point in time.
We've completed about 4 or 5 miles this year. I don't have the exact number up. I could get it. And we did 1.9 miles last year, I believe. So total, we're in the 6 to 7 mile range on our system right now.
Okay. And then I'm looking for the units on this slide for, okay, so it looks like on this unit, it shows for tier, it shows for undergrounding 200 to 244 miles of undergrounding in tier 3, 120 to 146 in tier 2. And then is covered conductor on the previous page?
Yes, let me scroll up for that. Right here, C7, these two.
Okay. And the one, is that the on the C7T1, it shows a 1 and a 1.
2020.
That was 2020. So this is a significant ramp up of covered conductor, right?
Correct.
Okay. And so well, first question is, are you learning lessons in deploying this? Because this seems like this is kind of like a new covered conductor, one mile, earlier, and now 5 miles as of today, or maybe 7 miles. So I don't know, something. And now you're going to be doing a lot more. Is the utility experiencing lessons learned, or things that they have to work through in deploying this relatively new mitigation?
Yeah, we're definitely studying it as we go. And to your point, Chris, there hasn't been enough of it to actually make any major conclusions. But some of the things we're learning is how many, for example, how many steel poles can be reutilized and we don't have to replace them. We don't have an exact numbers, but those are the types of things we're gathering as we're implementing the covered conductor. And then some areas require larger size wire. And so the cost increases could lead us to revisit and reevaluate whether it makes sense to apply the covered conductor or switch, for example, to underground, just because the sizing ends up being a lot bigger and costing a lot more and having to put in intercept poles. So we are learning a lot of different things as we're implementing. We don't have necessarily things we can report on just yet, but we're definitely learning as we go from the pilot. But we do see a lot of potential in it. I mean, the bare conductor hardening that we've done has given us about 47% reduction in ignition rates that we've studied just from the past, and we think the covered conductor could at least, come close to that and give that added value of reducing the potential for foreign object contact starting ignitions.
Okay. Okay. You mentioned an intercept pole. What is an intercept pole?
That's if we have to basically put in new poles between spans because the wire ends up being too heavy and needs some additional support.
Okay. Well, I appreciate kind of giving me this initial look at especially the bare conductor, and then I think you were going to walk us through the price for like covered conductor and underground.
Sure. So, I think Joe might have a question.
Yeah, may I interject a question here, Chris? It's related to some of the questions you asked.
Of course. Sure.
Okay, this is regarding ACSR cable. In the case where you have strand breakage on the ACSR, whether or not it causes tension loss in the conductor, is that considered a risk event, or is that considered a wire down? And to what extent are you replacing any ACSR cable as part of your hardening program?
Sure, I can answer those. So first, the way we define risk events is when there's an overhead fault on the system. So if there is some minor fraying of the strands that does not lead to any kind of fault or disturbance on the system, it would not be a risk event. If the strand caused something to slip, break, shake, cause a fault, then it would become a risk event. So it can kind of go either way there. A wire down, by our definition, and I believe it's an IEEE definition, is when the conductor falls or moves from its intended place and makes contact with an object it is not intended to make contact with. That makes it a wire down. So it could fall onto the ground, it could fall onto a tree or some other object, but once it makes contact with something else, that is when we consider it a wire down. As far as replacing the ACSR, that I think I can't give a real definitive answer there. We're certainly not targeting it. If it's found to be, fraying or damaged in any way as part of an inspection, the construction supervisors in the area will look at it and make determinations on the appropriate correction. I couldn't give you much more details than that than to say, it would get passed on to be reviewed and corrected how our QEWs feel is appropriate.
So that's more of a repair program. Are you targeting, when you're looking at the circuits that you're planning to replace, is it mostly then copper wire and not ACSR then? Or...
Correct. The copper, correct. Yeah, the copper wire was originally was the real known type of conductor that had a larger failure type than the aluminum conductors.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll just ask really quick on that topic. I believe there was a study that PG&E had done years and years ago about conductor failures, and I think the number 6 copper was like at the top of the list, and I believe ACSR was another one. But I guess SDG&E either doesn't have a lot of that, or they're not finding a big problem with that. Is that what your understanding is, Sean?
Yeah, might have to do some more digging into the types of conductor we have and the faults that we've seen. Based on what the firm team put together when they first started, they were looking at the wire down events and the types of failures we've had on our system, and they identified again the number 4, number 6 copper as being the problematic conductors. I'm not sure where ACSR or some of the others would have ranked back then in that initial study, which was again in that 2014 kind of range when they were doing a lot of this work. So I know that that's what they determined. Where ACSR fell, I'm not certain.
Thank you.
Can I ask a quick one? Why are you replacing wood poles with steel poles? I assume steel poles are much more expensive than like a higher class wood pole. So have you done studies that show steel poles have significantly higher risk reduction than like a higher class wood pole?
No, so when it comes to wood versus steel, the issue isn't so much the pole loading. The issue becomes more that the steel poles have from the factory have a more known consistency that we're able to dictate on the materials, and they are much more resilient to fire. So if we do have a fire go through the area, it's much less likely we would have to replace a steel pole, and therefore allows us to do our reconstruction and get our customers back online quicker, more so than stopping the initial fault itself.
Okay. What would you say the cost premium is, just ballpark, for steel pole versus wood pole?
I am not sure. I'd have to do the research on that to find a like for like kind of comparison of wood to steel.
Okay, thanks.
This is Jonathan Wilmer. I just wanted to add to the response to Joe's question, Joseph Mitchell's question about the ACSR, and even Chris's, that as a result of our covered conductor and undergrounding work, covering more of a entire segment hardening approach, right? Regardless of the conductor size, we're going to be replacing it. So in other words, type of conductor, whether it's copper or ACSR size, whether it's number 4, number 2, or number 6, that will be replaced as part of the whole segment. That was kind of the change that we made, right? Instead of targeting just the number 4, number 6 copper wire that we initially were targeting as part of our bare wire or traditional hardening, we are now doing more full segment approaches. So that includes the additional, risk that may come, and trying to cover the additional risk that may come from ACSR or other types of wires.
All right, Chris, any questions on this, or do you want me to continue the discussion to help answer the cost per mile for the other two programs?
Sure, that sounds good. The cost per mile for the other programs. Thank you.
Okay. So without going into the details, it's the same approach you can take. So you can look at table 10 for the range of the cost for covered conductor, and it's broken out by tier 3 versus tier 2, and then look at the range of the cost, the units. And the average estimate ends up coming to about 1.6 million a mile for the covered conductor. And then for the underground, it's an estimate close to the 2.8, 2.9 million a mile. Similar approach to what I walked through, but just to give you the direct answers for those two other programs, those are the two costs per mile for them.
Thank you. And I think when you were looking at the cost per mile for bare conductor, the range was per mile was not very large. It was very close, I thought. Is that the same for the covered conductor and the underground? When you say 1.6 million, is that plus or minus, how much?
Yeah, on
Okay.
average, all the cost ranges, I believe, have like a 10 plus or minus 10%. So
Okay.
it's within that range.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thanks. And I don't know if you happen to know this or, but the underground, I think the general impression is that in terms of knocking down the risk, underground knocks down the risk the greatest compared to covered conductor or bare conductor replacement, if that's fair to say. And the underground is more expensive. Is there an associated increased cost for maintenance of underground compared to covered conductor or bare conductor? I don't know if that's captured anywhere, or do you have a sense of that? Because I think with underground, maybe it requires less maintenance. I'm not sure, but then if there is a problem, maybe the maintenance cost is greater. I don't know if anyone can speak to those kind of like other attributes of these different mitigation alternatives. That there's that cost that you've explained for installation, but then I was wondering, what about ongoing maintenance, either increased or reduction in the near term or the long term? Do you have any experience with that for these to compare these different alternatives?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Chris. That's something that we are at the early stages of developing. That's what we're calling our life cycle cost analysis. We definitely see a gap that could help paint a more complete picture when we're talking about these programs, and that's why we started doing it this year. So I don't have exact numbers to report on, but I can tell you that for example, for projects that we're scoping for 2023, we're now looking, on a circuit by circuit basis, how much underground are we scoping? What were the prior costs of maintenance? What could they look like post underground? We're also looking at vegetation management and try to come up with some estimates of what vegetation management is going to look like post implementation of some of these projects. And we're doing the same for covered conductor. Generally speaking, if a system stays overhead, a lot of the same inspections will remain in place. We may need to repair them a little less because they're newer, but the general programs, the O&M programs like tree, the vegetation management and asset inspection would still be in place. I think underground has the biggest potential to reduce some ongoing costs, but that's still something that we're studying. And we're also looking at PSPS costs, which is a little more difficult to tie in, but we're doing our best to try to come up with a comprehensive study that gives us that life cycle cost analysis to add to what we're looking at here.
Okay, I believe my impression is that SDG&E, among all the utilities, may have some of the greatest experience with underground distribution. I don't know if that's true or not, but you have a lot of underground distribution, a lot of underground, right? Is that correct?
We do have a lot of underground. I think undergrounding for the sake of fire risk reduction is relatively new. I will let Jonathan chime in here. If there's something more specific he can share, he definitely has a lot of that history.
Yeah, Chris, so yeah, we do have a lot of undergrounding, right? 60% of our distribution system is undergrounded in overall service territory, and 2,500 miles of our HFTD is undergrounded, but not as a result of wildfire mitigation, just as part of development when it was installed. So the 50 miles that we have installed so far, beginning in 2020, is the experience we have with the HFTD. Now, overall, though, your question with overall underground experience, underground does give you more resiliency to weather, right? As long as it's not flooding like in the East Coast and stuff like that. But as far as the weather conditions that we face, more resiliency around that. We do experience longer troubleshooting when it comes to trying to find a problem in the underground system as compared to the overhead, because you do have the capability of having the advantage of visual right on the overhead. You can see things better. The undergrounding requires a fault testing, which is more involved in using tools and equipment. The other thing I want to say is, on the other hand, on the underground, you do have that reduced, vegetation management. You do have also a little bit more, less susceptibility to incidentals, right? Meaning animal contact or, tree limbs or, other third-party type contacts. You have less of that on the underground, although you could still get underground facilities like pad-mounted transformers get hit with vehicles every so often. Now, we expect that in the backcountry there'll be less of that, right, in the HFTD areas that we have as compared to the urban areas. But overall, more reliability, more requirements when it comes to troubleshooting, more duration, more time required for troubleshooting. But with a newer system, that will be years before we get to a lot of the underground troubles that we see on more older systems.
Thank you. So how about if you determine through troubleshooting that you need to do a fix? I don't know whether it's going to be a cable replacement or something else. Is that a lot more difficult with underground, or is that the same as like doing overhead, or how does that compare?
It's sometimes even easier on the underground, just because we have cable and conduit, right? So you pull it out of the PVC pipes that we have, or conduit that we have. You take out once you find it, you take out the old cable, you pull in the new, right? And it's actually quicker in terms of replacing the cable. It does take a little bit more time if you think about just the connections that it takes, right, and the preparation around it, because we have to isolate that particular failed cable, the grounding to protect our employees and all of that. So the process is a little bit more involved. So that part takes between the troubleshooting, the process of isolating the faulted cable and preparing it for safety, and all of that takes longer. So overall, I think it's comparable. The overhead outages tend to be shorter in duration when it comes to just a fuse failure or a transformer failure or something like that. When it comes to a wire replacement, it's similar.
Hey, Chris, this is Eric Wojcik of UCAN. Just real quick, if I can chime in. I was a commissioner advisor for 6 years, overseeing all of that. We wrote the general orders on undergrounding, and all the experience we had with all of the general rate cases and the data we had at that time has all been confirmed by these people's comments, I think. There's nothing I would disagree with. I would definitely say that the maintenance is much, much lower. The reliability is much, much higher. And when you do have to work, you're not up in the air. I mean, you're working in a vault. So there's a whole set of advantages with undergrounding where it's not wet and can be flooded a lot, like in the East Coast. So, sorry, I'm the consumer advocate on this side now, but I'm a huge fan of the undergrounding. It's just a simpler, easier system, and it's more reliable, and it has less low total life cycle costs.
Thank you. I forgot your name. I'm sorry.
Eric Wojcik. Dr.
Okay,
Eric Wojcik,
okay,
you
got
can.
it. Yes,
Yeah.
thank you. Yes. And what I'm curious is so this year, SDG&E has completed on the order of 5 miles of covered conductor. Was there a target that SDG&E had either last year or the year before or whatever for the number of miles of covered conductor to complete by this point in time, September, I guess?
So we have our quarterly projections that we provide in our quarterly initiative updates that we have to file to energy safety as part of our wildfire mitigation plan. And so our Q3 report will be coming out in November. I could look up, what our quarterly target was for Q2 and where we actually came in, but all that should be available on our website as part of our quarterly initiative update as well.
Yeah, do you have a sense for it? Because what I was trying to understand is, so I understand, you've mentioned the benefits, the risk benefits of covered conductor and undergrounding. I think one question I have in my mind is, how much of it is it achievable, and how much of it is so the risk is there regardless. Right now there's no mixture of bare conductor hardening or conductor replacement for wildfire mitigation, if I understand it, beginning in 2022. And I'm just wondering, should there be a mix so that perhaps a lot greater number of miles could be hardened if it's going to be difficult to achieve aspirations of hardening with covered conductor and or undergrounding? I was trying to get a sense of, you mentioned you're going to have a report coming out, but and maybe there's been some reports in the past, but is SDG&E, is your experience that you're able to solidly achieve the objectives, the targets with these new mitigations? Because I know there's probably a lot of challenges that come up, and I just wonder if I could get a sense for what your experience has been, and if there should be more of a mix of bare conductor, because it can then reduce risk at perhaps a much faster, expedited rate, especially if it's targeted towards greatest risk. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, Sean.
Yeah, and I think that's precisely why you see it ramping up slowly, right? We did 2 miles roughly of covered conductor last year. This year our target was 20. The next year it goes up to I believe 60 or so, and it continues to increase from there. Again, that was done purposefully to ensure that we had the opportunity to learn these lessons and put processes and procedures in place so we could achieve our targets. Going through our most recent quarterly initiative update for covered conductor, we were expecting to have 1 mile done at the end of Q2, and we actually had 1.2 miles done. Our expected progress at the end of Q3 is 7 miles, and I believe right now we're right at 6. So we're on target to hit that as well, and then 20 by the end of the year, which is still our goal and still we feel achievable. For undergrounding, we expected to have 19 miles done at the end of Q2. We actually had 17.9 miles completed at the end of Q2, so we're pretty close to our target, and we expect to have 25 by the end of the year. So again, we're on target with both of those programs right now and feel confident in those in achieving those numbers moving forward.
Thank you. And in terms of the overall context of this risk, so you have tier 3 and you have tier 2, and you're doing covered conductor and you're doing undergrounding. And I think you may have touched upon this at a previous workshop, but just for now, what is the overall need for this for covered conductor and for undergrounding for tier 2 and tier 3, just so that I can put these numbers into context?
When you say the overall need, are you talking about how many miles we're targeting?
Yes, overall
Yeah.
miles of line that needs to be hardened in this fashion in tier 2 and tier 3. I know
Sure.
it's going to go beyond what you have in the near term number of years, but what's the overall need to do for this kind of hardening?
Are you thinking for the ramp timeframe? What are the targets?
So the ramp may have some targets. I would be interested in those, but one of the things that Cal Advocates has been advocating for in the rulemaking and in the ramps is to have everything put in context. So, you know, we can see what's in the ramp. Yeah, that's very useful. But also so that we know, well, okay, we're going to do a couple 100 miles here, but are there thousands of miles that need to be done so that we have the big picture as well as what's in front of us, as well as what's been done to this point in time. So, okay, yeah, thank you. And I think that was one of our questions,
Yeah.
I guess. How many miles will remain to be hardened after 2031?
Yeah, I got you. Okay, so the big picture I think you have from this slide that we prepared, that's the overall estimate based on analysis we did towards the end of last year. We're going to be reevaluating and revisiting this, so it could change. The overall miles that will remain to be hardened after 2031, rough estimate right now is 1,700 miles, but again, that could be revisited and changed based on updated models. It kind of continues to evolve, but that's the ballpark estimate for now. And then I think you also asked the number of miles that were already hardened prior to 2020. We came up with an estimate, just kind of looking at our system, using some proxies to estimate those numbers based on the types of poles and wires in the system. Roughly prior to 2020, we've hardened about 700 distribution miles and approximately 400 transmission miles.
So on this slide, it shows 235 bare wire for 2020 to 2022. And I think on another slide, you were showing maybe, I'm just trying to understand that with the table, you were showing 48 for what year? Or 44?
Yeah, so there's a little bit of overlap there, Chris. What we're showing in this slide, this was specifically for the PSPS public briefing. The time frame right here, 2020 through 2022, that's showing the current WMP cycle. So part of it is now part of the ramp. It starts at 2022. And so part of this 235 is actually in the ramp spanning 2022, 2023, and then 2024. So those targets for the ramp are in the ramp chapter that I was showing in this table. But this particular slide includes 2 years that are outside of the ramp. Does that make sense?
I'm kind of a little bit lost. So I see the 235 year for 2020 to 2022 for bare wire.
Correct.
And
so part of the 235, so I think it's just the 5 miles out of the 235 are in the ramp for the ramp time frame. The other 200 is split between 2020 and 2021.
Yeah, the way this slide was put together is not was not meant for ramp. So the timelines there are not our ramp timelines. So it's a little different. It's not exactly apples and apples there with ramp in that slide.
okay, so if I think you're saying 5 of this is in the ramp of the 235. So then there was maybe 100 plus miles of bare wire that was hardened.
Yeah, I think when we were looking at it here, I'll go back. The 2020 numbers
Sarah,
roughly add up.
Yeah, this is helpful. We did have a work paper that was on our website for ramp that has all the historical 5-year historical plus the 3 forecast years for ramp for all of our units and our dollars available. It was SDG&E Risk 1 WP, Risk 1 work paper. And I think that would help out a lot, Chris, because it does detail year by year, again, 5-year historicals with the 3-year forecast, all of our units and dollars.
I guess so on this slide that you're showing here, it shows conductor recorded units for 2020. And oh no, 54. Okay, you got HFTD 3, HFTD 2. I see. Okay.
Yep.
All right. Okay.
So 2021
okay.
is not shown here, but it's roughly around the same total.
Okay. Okay. Got it. Okay. Now, if we could go back to the question or the other table. Thank you.
There you go.
Yeah. May I just ask a question on a follow-up question for Chris? How much can you potentially deploy for undergrounding and covered conductor per year? I mean, are there any sort of limitations on that? What is feasible? What are the limits? What limits you as far as how much you could potentially divert to either covered conductor or undergrounding?
Yeah.
So
So
we talk. Yeah, go ahead, Sean.
Go ahead, sir. Okay. Yeah. So when we're looking at the numbers, we can be limited by how much design and engineering, completed scope of work we can accomplish in any given year, and we're also limited by the number of crews to do the actual construction work on any given year. And if you look at our ramp filing, again, that was another part of why it ramps up slowly. Up front, we have to do a lot of design and engineering work to have work available in those outer years for the construction to actually get done. I would say, Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong, but once we get to the 2024 numbers out there, moving forward beyond that, our plan is probably going to be to stay close to those sorts of numbers, meaning that's close to the most we can probably do in any given year.
Yeah, that's right, Sean. So Joe, we talk to our engineering teams basically to say, hey, what do you think is reasonable to set as a target for covered conductor? And for the overhead work, it tends to be close to what we've seen in the past with traditional hardening. There's a lot of similarities, especially when we're talking about wood to steel replacements. Obviously, covered conductor is new, but we're kind of roughly estimating around a similar target we can achieve with overhead hardening. And so the ramp up really is looking to get to that roughly 100-mile a year for covered conductor. And then for the underground, maybe a little ambitious, and that's why we took a slow ramp up for that. But we went, I think, from 50 to 100, 125, and then we're landing at maybe the 150. And we will be studying that as we go to see what's realistic and what isn't. There's also permitting issues that could limit the amount of scope that we can achieve, and sensitive areas maybe we can't dig through. So those numbers could change, but the target that we're trying to get to with underground is ultimately the 150 a year, and I think that starts in 2024.
And with the do the resources overlap between undergrounding and covered conductor? Is it the same teams working on them, or are they separate teams and independent?
So
upfront we have, oh, go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, the contract crews that we have on board, the QEWs themselves typically are qualified to do either overhead or underground construction. Some of the limitations you run into, though, are the ancillary pieces. So for undergrounding, we also need the trenching crews and the people to to dig the holes and lay all the conduit, which is not a restraint that we typically have on the overhead, where you're just going pole to pole. So you don't need the trenching crews. Typically, like I said, the QEW crews can overlap a little bit, but there are some specialized crews that are required for undergrounding that you don't need for overhead.
So on earlier, Sarah, you were explaining the context and of these numbers up here, and I think you were saying, I'm looking at my notes, remain after 2031 would be 1,700 miles, and that was for. Do you know how, would you be able to break that down between covered conductor and underground and transmission and distribution?
So yeah, let me explain a little bit more. So the 1,700 distribution miles that we're saying will remain to be hardened post 2031 is really miles we haven't assigned a mitigation to. It's more, we need to study them further. They're just less priority than the miles we're going to mitigate in these years in the short term, essentially. So the 1,700 miles is not necessarily going to be 50-50, you know, covered conductor underground or necessarily one or the other. That will be studied through our modeling efforts as we go.
Okay, and that will be after, right now you would be saying what you're doing between 2023 and 2031 would be 880 plus 833. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay, and then I think you were giving me the numbers that were prior to 2020, and I was trying to jot those down.
Yeah, the rough. Did you want me to repeat those, Chris?
Yes, please. I mean, unless were those written down in one of the documents that Joe sent us before the meeting, or?
I don't think so. So I'll be happy to repeat those.
Okay.
So for distribution miles, it's about 725 prior to 2020 that we've hardened. And for transmission miles, it's about 440 miles that we've hardened prior to 2020.
Okay. When you're considering hardening, like let's say if you talk about the 725 miles of distribution, is that like from, you know, decades ago, or is that going back 3, 4 years, 5 years, do you know?
That goes back to 2008.
Okay.
So we said that after the 2007 wildfires in SDG&E service territory, we started keeping track of some of the hardening. Now, some of that hardening in 2008, you know, may or may not be up to the standards we would expect right now, but it does go back to 2008.
Okay, thank you. And then as long as we're on this slide, we're asking about the total risk reduction effectiveness. I think you were explaining something about like a 47%. Sarah, I think you were talking about a 47% decrease. I don't know if that was.
Yeah, so let's break it down a little bit. There's a difference between overall risk reduction in terms of taking the total risk points and how much we think they're going to move versus the effectiveness of a mitigation. So there's two key components that go into calculating this big picture total risk reduction. There's other ones, but I'll just highlight a couple. One of it is the exposure. So if you have 10-mile segment and you're only mitigating 5 miles, you're only mitigating 50% of the risk on that segment, right? But to add to that, that 50% you're mitigating when you underground, you know, do the undergrounding on that segment, it's effective for only that 50% of the segment, right? Because you're only doing 5 miles out of 10, for example. So the effectiveness is really kind of agnostic to the mileage. It's basically the question of, hey, if we take out this bare wire and we put in a cover conductor on this span, how effective do we think this is going to be? And for cover conductor, the effectiveness estimate is 62%. And that's roughly based on prior studies for traditional hardening, in addition to some SME estimates around how much additional effectiveness we're going to get from insulating the wire now that we're hardening it up to our standards. So the effectiveness for the 3 programs that you're looking at here that we're assuming for bare wire is 47%, and that's based on efficacy studies that we completed last year, looking at our prior traditional hardening work, the data, how much faults we had, how many faults we had before, how many faults we had after in those areas that we've hardened with, wood to steel, replacing the copper wire with stronger wire, those types of things. We got the number 47% as an effectiveness that we can then apply to the different scopes of mitigations that we're implementing to come up with a risk reduction estimate. And then for cover conductor, it's 62%. That's the estimate for effectiveness. And for underground, it's close to 100%, practically 100%. Does that help?
Yeah, yeah, that's very helpful. So, so you mentioned you gathered this effectiveness is by looking at faults and faults after hardening, I guess. And so
Correct.
underground, I guess you're saying you underground it and you're not really seeing any issues with it. And then with bare conductor, well, you see, I'm not exactly sure how you do that 47%. Do you actually look at frequency of faults and then the frequency of faults afterwards? And then
Yes.
do like a divider to say, okay, this is 47% effective?
Yes, so we looked at our unhardened system, historical numbers, and we took all of the faults and turned it into a faults per year per mile number. So, and then we took the hardened system and came up with the same metric, faults per year per mile of hardened system, and compared the two. And for our data, it showed that 47% reduction in the number of faults per year per mile of the hardened versus the unhardened.
Okay, and are you able to give us a sense of what those faults were? I mean, we talked earlier about wires down, and you mentioned an IEEE standard for
these are not just
that.
these are not just wire downs. These would be any faults on the overhead system.
And can you give us a sense of like what that categorization or distribution of faults are? So, I mean, like is wires down half of those
Wires down.
faults, 10%, or,
Oh, I would say that I would have to look at the total summary. So that we bucketed a lot of them. There were weather-related faults, third-party contact faults, foreign object and line faults, and equipment failure faults were some of the buckets. Wires down would be a small percentage of the overall faults that we have.
Thanks. So, in terms of ignition or wildfire risk, you mentioned, weather, third-party foreign object, wires down, equipment failure. Do you parse that out or break that down in terms of like which are more important in terms of wildfire risk? Or do you have a
Are you
sense?
talking about the drivers in the risk bow tie, Chris?
Well, I was thinking of this. You've done an analysis of effectiveness for these mitigations with undergrounding being like 100%. It looks like this effectiveness is looking strictly at frequency.
It's faults, and the way we look at it is that we have also done a study that show what percent of faults become ignitions on our system. And so what we're saying is we don't have enough ignitions on our system to properly do a study. In our table, I think it's table 7.2 in our WMP, we list how many ignitions we have every year, and it's a very small number. Whereas on average, we'll have a few hundred faults on our system, and so we can't use the ignitions, although that would be maybe a better, more direct number to use to predict these things, because we just don't have enough. It's not statistically significant. And so we use faults as a proxy for ignitions, knowing that a certain percentage of overhead faults will cause or can cause a spark and can and will lead to an ignition. And that percentage change depending on whether it's tier 3 or tier 2, what the FPI is on any given day. We can kind of separate those sorts of things out, but we do have some average numbers. And so we use the faults as a proxy for the ignitions, again, because the number of ignitions is too small.
So I understand that the number of ignitions is too small. Well, it's small. Do you have a sense, though, for what types of fault are more inclined or lend themselves to ignitions? I understand that you have like a limited number of ignitions, but is there a way to understand which specific types of faults are going to be the ones that are greater likelihood of being an ignition or ignition to a wildfire?
We do also know by driver what the ignition rate is by driver. So we know, for example, veg contacts, we average 12 of those a year, and the ignition rate is 13% or so, which means we average 1.67 veg ignitions per year. And we do have that data broken out by, again, by distribution risk driver. But again, the number of ignitions is small. On average, right, we have 1 or 2 veg ignitions every year, and so applying those percentages blanketly to things, we haven't taken that step yet. But we do know, we do have that data available.
Okay. Okay, so basically when it comes to the effectiveness, back to the effectiveness, basically you're looking at the number of faults, and then actually, I guess after you replace bare wire with covered conductor, your effectiveness is 62%. So it sounds like if you were to look at it, you say, if you had 100 faults as an arbitrary number with your with not hardening the conductor at all, and then you replace it with cover conductor, and prior year you had 100 faults, now you're going to find you have 38% faults for the next year. Is that kind of like what the overall meaning of this is?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. 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 Well,
and those are filtered a little bit to only include faults that can lead to ignitions, which is why underground becomes near 100%. Because even though you can have faults on the underground system, those faults can't or typically don't lead to ignitions.
Got it. So I think if I understand that right, you're saying that while underground is close to 100%, that doesn't mean that you may still have other faults underground, but you're not counting those because you're only looking at faults that can lead to ignition. Okay.
Correct.
Okay. Okay, I appreciate that. And is there a place where you can point me to, or do you have information about an RSE for each of these 3 types of mitigation?
Yeah, Chris, for that one, there's a good summary included in one of the work papers. This one is titled Final 2021 Work Paper SDG&E Wildfire Level 2. And in it, there is a tab titled Rse Summary. And all the way to the right here is where the RSE values are for every mitigation, broken out by tiers to the extent that it applies.
So you're talking about one of the tabs, or which tab are you talking about?
This tab that I'm on is called Rse Summary.
Oh, I don't
And
think
I believe this file was included in what Joe sent. Joe, can you confirm that?
Yeah, we're not seeing that on the WebEx at the moment, I don't think.
Yeah, I think,
Sorry, let me share my, go ahead, Joe. I think that we
yes,
shared
yes.
the Excel file.
Those are part of the email I sent out this morning. And so it should look familiar when she loads it up.
Yeah, give me 1 second here. All right, let me know if you can see it now.
Making its way.
Yeah, it looks
There
like
we
it's
go.
thinking.
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, this is the file that we're referring to. And there is a tab here called Rse Summary. And in column Z, you have the RSE per $1 million for readability. But you can basically filter to the 3 programs that specifically you're looking at, for example. And we can scroll down here. Overhead distribution hardening, bare covered conductor, and then the strategic undergrounding should be somewhere here for both tier 2, tier 3. And there you go. These are the risk spend efficiency values for that. I can zoom in a little bit. Can you see that, Chris?
Yeah, I was trying to pull, I have a spreadsheet open, but it's not, for some reason, I must have the wrong version of it because I can't find that tab on my tabs. It looks like there's only supposed to be 4 tabs on this.
Is the spreadsheet you have open the one with many tabs down at the bottom, each tab?
That's
Yeah,
a different one, yeah.
that's a different one. That shows additional
yeah.
detail. Yeah, that one shows
This one says
additional detail
RSE.
as to how some of these values were, how some of these individual values were calculated.
I see. Okay, so now I have it, and you're saying it's off to the far right, and then you're looking. So it looks like you're saying okay, I appreciate that. In the cost numbers that you gave earlier about the cost per mile of the different mitigations, do you anticipate those having, I thought I saw like maybe in some other proceeding about like an expectation for those numbers to change over time, or to, do you feel that those are pretty stable at this point for those cost per mitigation, or do you think that they're really just an initial estimate in terms of those costs for undergrounding, cover conductor, and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, we feel comfortable with where the estimates are now. We do see some changes. You know, we're trying to drive costs down for the underground, but because we have a limited scope, we can't, you know, take one cost for a project that was relatively cheaper than other projects and say this is what the cost per mile is going to be. So I think we're in the ballpark with what you're seeing, and as we get closer to the GRC, we'll definitely have refined estimates that will go into the refined recalculations of everything in the rate case. But for now, the estimates that you have in the ramp, we're pretty comfortable with.
Okay, and in terms of this column here, and I guess you filtered it, I found it fine, but this RSE per million, this is kind of like taking the risk score and dividing it by the capital cost. I mean, mainly these are all capital cost, I take it. So you take the capital cost and then
Yeah, I believe we're adding both the capital and O&M just to give a total cost of the project, for example, or the mitigation.
okay.
The risk spend efficiency represents the risk reduction per dollar. So it's not just the risk score divided by the dollar. It's, you know, we look at the risk score before, what we think it's going to look like after, taking into account the effectiveness, how much we're actually mitigating. And then we take that difference between the pre and post, and that's what goes into the risk spend efficiency.
Okay, And the cost is mostly capital cost.
Yeah, for these projects, yes.
Okay, and with capital costs, that then gets put in, just if you have this understanding, that gets put into rate base over a period of time, over the beginning and when it gets installed in the ground, and then it earns a rate of return, I guess, as part of rate base. Do I have that right?
Roughly, I'm going to ask the rate case team to maybe chime in, but yeah, generally speaking, I think your understanding is correct. Joe or Jamie?
Hey, Chris, this is Joe. Yes, you're correct. When we develop the revenue requirements, we take the dollars and we put them into our revenue requirement model. And to the extent the capital projects are amortized over whether it's a book life or the anticipated life of the project, yes. And then our return on investment, return of investment, and then the depreciation, the taxes aspect, that all goes into the revenue requirement.
So, but for purposes of this calculation, this is where it's really done at taking the whole thing at the install price. It's not looking at the accrual over years and when it gets into rate base and that kind of stuff. This is just looked at, okay, this is the install cost.
We refer to that as direct dollars. Yes. These are the direct dollars in, I think for ramp purposes, it was 2020 vintage, if you will, direct dollars.
All right. Okay. 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 I'm grateful for you walking me through this. You mentioned about topics, and I think one of the other things that relates to this, you mentioned that, we had asked last time about technology and that kind of stuff.
Sure. Do you want to switch gears to that, Chris, or do you want to go back
that
to
might
your?
Be a little bit out of order, but I'm just worried about time, and this is all kind of related. So.
Yeah, no problem. This workshop is for you, so you can guide us here. I think we talked about advanced protection in particular. So we have Sean and Jonathan ready to go. We don't have a specific thing to dive into right away. So if you want to ask us the questions you have top of mind for those, we'll do our best to answer them.
Okay, sure. So, I think some utilities are looking at different technological mitigations. Like I think people are familiar somewhat with Refcol. And I know that SDG&E has talked about we de-energize the wire before it hits the ground in some kind of study that SDG&E has done. There's also this thing I've seen about Ting. I don't know if you're familiar with Ting, but it's some kind of thing where a utility, it's not a capital expense or a capital cost. It's a service where people can get indications of disturbances on wires, and that gets recorded and can be alerted. I'm just wondering, has SDG&E, do they have RSEs and that calculated for some of these alternative programs? Because I'm curious how that compares to these capital intensive programs that may take long periods of time to achieve their benefits. If there's other technological ones that can maybe not be as they might get the same effectiveness score, but perhaps they could be expedited and put in place. And I'm curious if SDG&E has that kind of analysis on these other kinds of alternative mitigations.
Yeah, Chris, this is Sean. So one of the ones you mentioned was our advanced protection, which includes our falling conductor protection that you mentioned, where we do have we've been upgrading equipment and communications out on some of our distribution lines so that we have high-speed relays available on these lines that can operate in time. Once they sense a break in the conductor, they can operate fast enough to de-energize that conductor before it makes contact with the ground. I think Sarah had up some of the RSEs before. Sarah, if you don't mind checking for me, it's C11 is advanced protection. If you could see the RSE that we have for it, I think we provided an RSE for it.
Yeah.
But I do want to just make the distinction between RSEs and overall risk reduction. RSEs, again, are risk reduction per dollar spent, whereas we're also calculating the overall amount of risk we're reducing on the system, and it's important to look at both sides of that coin. Whereas if we do some of these things that are very high RSE, it might be because they're reducing a small amount of risk, but also cost a small amount of money. And also to get that overall larger risk reduction, you do need to do some more of these capital intensive projects, which have a larger risk reduction, even if the RSE maybe isn't as high. So it's important to look at both pieces of that when making our mitigation selections.
Yes, and Sean, I have it in front of me. So for example, for the advanced protection that we're implementing in Tier 3, we have an RSE of 309 compared to an RSE of underground, for example, in Tier 3 of 155, largely driven by cost. But if you look at the risk reduction potential, obviously the underground really gives us a lot more benefit and value. So it's hard to just look at the RSE and not think about the risk reduction objectives as well.
Yeah, I would just add to this, Jonathan, Chris. Yeah, it's something that we don't look at as one or the other, right? As far as advanced protection, we believe that it's a good mitigation measure, even for the areas where we're not hardened yet. But we don't believe that it's necessarily going to be in place of or instead of cover conductor, for example, or some of our areas where we're hardening. So we still want to, when we do, install advanced protection along with when we are hardening. And just a side note, the Ting, we did look at the Ting technology, and we're exploring whether that would be applicable and a good measure to implement in our system, but we're still in the early stages of looking at that.
Thank you. So how many miles of circuit is now operational under the advanced, do you call it advanced fault detection? Or I don't know what you call it.
We call it our falling conductor protection, FCP, or it's part of our advanced protection kind of grouping of projects. And we've installed it across 14 circuits prior to 2021. And so the actual miles of that, I'd have to double check. Yeah, give me a minute to look up the number of miles of those circuits. We've been tracking it by circuit implemented and not by miles. So just give me a minute to look that up.
Sure, thank you. I don't know if this would be for you or Jonathan, but you mentioned Ting and you're studying it. Are you also studying Refcol? Or I understand that may lend itself more to certain types of circuit configurations than others. I don't know whether that's appropriate for SDG&E or not, but are you studying that or to determine something about it?
We did look at that and studied it quite extensively, and specifically took a special an actual substation site and looked at our equipment, looked at what it would take to convert our equipment and the circuits. Mostly it was requiring a lot of equipment change out. So basically almost all the transformers, just to give you an example, on our circuits would have to be changed out to accommodate Refcol. And so in the end, looking at the number of facilities you'd have to change out to accommodate Refcol, as well as the substation customization you have to do, and the effectiveness of it, right? Refcol is mostly for single fault, single phase faults, and so and specifically a phase to ground fault. And so looking at what our current advanced system protection can offer, and not just the full, the falling conductor protection, but other techniques that we have, and I can talk about more about those. The combination of advanced system protection that we can have, we felt was not going to, Refcol was not going to provide us a superior protection.
Okay. You mentioned the other techniques. Were you saying you were going to? Did you just say you were going to mention the other techniques?
Sure. Yep. So the other techniques are early fault detection is one of them, and what we have done is implemented it on one circuit so far, and we are continuing to expand our application of early fault detection. What that is looking at frayed wires, as Joseph Mitchell mentioned earlier, right? Frayed wires, and being able to detect that, or a tree limb that's sitting on a wire, right? It's intermittent, right? It's not something that's a hard fault. So looking at early failures that can be showing some signs, right? Some signatures of fault, and trying to get those early. So that's a technology we're deploying. The other is we've been doing this for many years, right? We talked about it a little bit, where in the last meeting, where we are implementing we don't set our reclosing in the HFTD anymore, right? So our reclosing is off in our devices. And what that is the field devices that we have the ability to trip, right, and close back in the old way, where they're trying to restore service back quickly. So that would be for an intermittent fault, right? So the reclosing is set off. We don't allow our protection devices to do that anymore. But we also have a setting that we use during when the PSPS events, when the high winds start to pick up, and it's during PSPS season, we'll set our field devices up to a sensitive profile. And what that means is that the devices will act faster when there is a fault, a wire down, a tree contact, or any other fault. These devices, field devices, will act faster and turn off the power. So that's an additional sensitive profile. We don't want to install that on a regular day, because that would cause too many outages and disruptions for customers. So that's specifically for these high wind events. And then finally, we have a sensitive ground fault setting. And what that does on the field devices and at the substations is it allows for the ground fault current, right, that comes through to be recognized faster by our relays, by our devices, so that it can trip faster. So that's what I mean by several techniques that we're deploying to that encompasses as part of our advanced system protection.
So those are very interesting. What I'm curious is, do you have RSEs for those as well? Are they on here? Okay.
It may be.
Yeah, I believe the reclosing and the sensitive settings, I believe, have RSEs. I'd have to look up what they were, but I do believe we calculated RSEs for those in as part of
I'll check those on the side here. Sensitive relays and reclosing.
Yeah, and then Chris, going back to your question about the advanced protection, I don't have the exact circuits we installed them on, so I used an average circuit length. And since we've done 14 circuits at an average circuit length of around 15 miles a circuit, you're looking at around 230 or so miles of circuits that are covered by the falling conductor protection. So that's a real ballpark number, though.
Is that the one where you have to, I don't know if there's a presentation SDG&E gave like some time ago where you almost have to fine tune it or something for the circuit, or is it pretty much you just install it, it works? You don't have to tweak it or tune it over time, or do you know?
So our system protection engineers do get those do make settings specific for the circuits. There is some baked in kind of like default logic that they have to use for the falling conductor protection. But for the sensitive settings and some of the other things, it is dependent upon the circuit, and they look at the average load and the peak load and all those other sorts of things specific to that circuit to come up with the settings that they apply on those devices.
Okay, and then for that and these other mitigations, are there RSEs and effectiveness numbers for each of these different ones? Technological.
Yeah, Christine is pulling those up for us now. They're in the our latest WMP. So the RSEs are quite high because there's almost no cost involved in implementing these things. So Christine, correct me if I'm wrong. It looks like for the sensitive profile settings, tier 3, the RSE was around 105,000 and around 46,000 for tier 2. And all this is our RSEs are provided in table 12 of our wildfire mitigation plan as well.
Yeah, so I think we included the RSEs in the WMP, but the ramp, because it doesn't have a specific cost item necessarily in the rate case, it doesn't have those specific RSEs, but we did come up with some estimates in the WMP.
How about for effectiveness?
We can check that.
I mean, sort of like the background of this is, you said almost no cost, right? So, I mean, that's a very attractive statement to hear. And if these have high RSEs, and if they're effective, even if they're not 100% effective, then are these basically are these going to be fully implemented to the extent possible in SDG&E's territory in the near term? Certainly over the period of its, in the next couple of years, or is this?
Yeah, the sensitive settings and the recloser protocols are already implemented and will continue to be implemented, and that's part of the reason why there is no more cost and why the RSE is so high is we've already developed the settings. They just refresh them every year, and then it's basically a SCADA push by some operators that takes maybe a day or so to do in order to implement all of them. So those things are currently implemented. The falling conductor protection continues to be implemented to more and more circuits. They started with all the tier 3 circuits, and I still believe they were on track to complete all the tier 3 circuits by 2026, I want to say is the right number. But I think we do in the ramp, we're on the order of 10 or so circuits per year that we'll be implementing falling conductor on moving forward. And that one does have a bit more cost to it because there is new equipment, new relaying and things that need to be installed at the substation in order to be able to implement these things.
So with implementation of those, does that then allow you to change the switch point for PSPS? Once you implement those, can you now then evaluate whether or not you're going to de-energize a circuit? No,
I don't think so. Again, the falling conductor helps prevent an energized contact due to when there's a wire down event or a conductor breakage event. What it doesn't protect against is items being blown into the line, animal contact, veg contact, the majority of our faults, and that's what we're concerned about in a PSPS event is during the high winds that the conductor may sway. There may be vegetation blowing through the air, there may be debris blowing through the air that can come in contact with the lines and cause a fault that can cause a spark that could lead to an ignition. And so the falling conductor protection, again, helps with a conductor breakage and a wire down event, but does not protect against all of those other types of faults that are more concerning during a PSPS.
So, so I guess I had assumed that it would, because if you're talking about making the circuit more sensitive so that it's going to, my understanding is going to trip quickly. And so there's going to be less energy delivered by the circuit in this kind of a fault, therefore less likely to ignite or less likely to ignite a wildfire. That's not the effectiveness. It doesn't, these do not lower ignitions or have any positive impact on ignitions to implement these technologies?
No, they certainly do. The problem becomes when you run into these extreme weather events. What we're most worried about is the existing conditions. So if our fire potential index is very high and the wind speed is very high, any type of ignition, even if it's reduced, could lead to a catastrophic wildfire because of the existing conditions. And that's kind of what needs to be weighed with PSPS is the risk of the wildfire because of the existing conditions, and again the risk of the PSPS event. And while the sensitive settings can certainly limit the amount of energy, and potentially do have some ignition reduction capability in there, it's not ignition elimination. And so that's kind of what we're weighing there when it comes to PSPS. And Jonathan, did you have something else to add?
Yeah, I was just going to say, the advanced system protections, right? The various techniques we talked about can reduce ignition, right? But it's not going to eliminate it. So we want to take all our tools available to us in our toolbox to fight, to mitigate fires, but it's not. The advanced system protection isn't going to cover all scenarios, so that's why we also need the PSPS.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
Joseph Mitchell, MGRA. Speaking about elimination strategies, if you had a combination of Refcol and covered conductor, are there any remaining scenarios that would lead to ignition? And what would the cost be of Refcol covered conductor combination in comparison to underground?
I think what we found and looked at, and I would have to look at our numbers, is combined with a number of equipment and mostly transformers and substation modifications that we needed to do, the undergrounding was starting to get pretty close. And then you add the covered conductor on top of that, because what I'm talking about is cost of the upgrades needed to accommodate Refcol without covered conductor. You add the covered conductor, I think the cost exceeded the undergrounding. With all that being said, you could get a lot of protection, but it would be rebuilding a whole system. And you might as well, at that point, we were looking at it going, if we're going to rebuild the whole system, maybe it's at that point you do want underground and cover all your bases. And my understanding of Refcol, and I'm not an expert on it, is that it's going to capture a lot, but it's not going to cover all situations, especially face-to-face type faults. But with the covered conductor, that could cover the face-to-face faults, although it may not cover everything. If there's some damage to the covered conductor, and there is a face-to-face, like a balloon that comes in contact with any kind of break in the covered conductor, then that could cause a potential or animal contact. But and the other thing I want to point out is you have equipment, right? You have transformers that are exposed. You have other equipment, fuses, and other things that could also cause ignition by the fact of balloons or animal contact coming across it, or other equipment, flying debris coming across it that could cause ignition. And it's not just the actual wire or the things that are out there on our system.
Thanks.
This is Wendy Amagdad. What do you mean when you say rebuild the whole system? Are you talking go from 4-wire to 3-wire system? Are you assuming the Refcol is more costly to implement because you have more 4-wire system?
Yeah, so it's a combination of things. So a lot of our distribution transformers would have to be replaced because we have a lot of single phase conductors, right, and single phase transformers, right? So there would have to be additional phases to be installed to balance out the capacitance that's needed to accommodate the Refcol technology. Because what the Refcol technology does is it tries to take the uninterrupted or the unfaulted phases and transfer the energy over, right, to reduce the fault and transfer it to the ground. So what it would take is changing out a lot of our transformers and upgrading our conductor, like we talked about, right, to covered conductor, so that we can reduce the system, the risk associated with the wire downs. And then, you know, there may also be substation related upgrades we looked at. So our substation transformers would have to also change. So you can imagine there's just a number of equipment and the costs. And I believe in Australia, when they implemented it, they actually got government grants to reduce the impact to ratepayers, reduce the cost impact to ratepayers.
But they did it in Australia, in the state of Victoria, because it was so much less costly than undergrounding our covered conductor.
Yeah, because of the remote area. Yeah, in some areas, yeah.
Hey folks, this is Joe. I just want to mention that it is 3 o'clock. I mentioned early on that the last couple of workshops we've run a bit long, and so we are certainly open to going a little bit longer. But we did identify 2 hours for this one, and we did identify we have a workshop scheduled for September 14th. We identified one topic that we think will take about an hour, and then we identified a TBT to be determined for the second hour. So to the extent we are not able to cover everything today, the option is there to include some of the topics that were anticipated to be discussed today. If we don't get a chance to discuss them, there's the potential to talk about it during the second half, if you will, on September 14th. So I just wanted to give that time check is all.
Thank you, Joe. Sarah, did you say that there is a place you can point us that has the effectiveness for these other mitigations?
Are you talking about the in general? I think the effectiveness numbers are included in the work paper that has the many tabs. So for each mitigation, we do have some of the effectiveness assumptions included there. And I can double check with the team if there's any other work paper that has that.
Yeah, so I mean, when you talk about changing the sensitivity settings and the maybe either for the Refcol, well, if Refcol is, I'm not sure, not Refcol. I think you've decided not to go with Refcol. But for example, the changing of the recloser settings and the pushing out that you can do on SCADA for the other more sensitive, maybe that's reclosers or maybe that's trip settings, I'm not sure. Is that like in a specific tab in the spreadsheet?
I see what you mean, Chris. So I think because those were almost no dollars, and this is more about the GRC and request for funding, those may not have been included specifically, but I'll circle around with the team to see what we can at least get you from the WMP.
All right. Then maybe we haven't talked much about PSPS, but if we scroll down in the list.
Yeah, let me share my screen again. Let me know if there's a specific area you want me to scroll down to.
if we're looking at our PDF file, maybe we could scroll down to, well, maybe we could initially scroll down to bullet 3. And I don't know if this is this generally applies to, I think, PSPS, but also wildfire hardening. But, and this came up before. I don't know if this is going to be a topic for the next workshop or not, but because I think Tern discussed it a little bit as well. But when you determine your allocation for mitigation programs, you determine RSEs, I guess risk ranking Appendix C1. I don't know if that was sent today. I might have a copy of it, but there were several mitigation programs that had different RSEs. And we could look at it. We talked about this at a prior workshop where the RSE might be somewhat low in one area, somewhat high in another area. But we were trying to get a sense for how SDG&E and SEMPRA go about using this information to determine how it allocates, how it's planning to allocate its mitigations of these different programs. So you might have one that it has a very high RSE, but you might, and I guess we could pull up a specific example perhaps, but I'd have to look for it. But you might see, oh, well, there's a whole lot of dollars going into this mitigation, and yet this doesn't have a very high RSE, yet there are a quite high number of dollars going into that. And I don't know if this is a topic for this one, because this generally applies across, I think, many of SEMPRA's mitigation programs, but how SEMPRA uses this information to determine those allocations. Okay, this one doesn't have a great as high an RSE, but we're going to put a whole lot of money into that area. Is that something that you can speak to?
Yeah, I think if I understand your question correctly, Chris, I think you're thinking about kind of portfolio-wide allocation. Like maybe it's cheap to just inspect and maintain rather than replace things. We don't look at it that way at this point. There are ongoing programs that have been around for a while, many of which are based on compliance requirements. So those continue to be put in place, and the funds are allocated to those according to what we have to complete, as well as where we're going above and beyond. I think the area where we are starting to use more we've done this in the grid hardening space. We've used more risk-informed strategies and models. An example of that was specifically figuring out which spans to mitigate with our traditional hardening or which poles to replace through our prime model. We're doing that again when we're looking at covered conductor versus underground, and we're looking at a combination of factors there. We're looking at how high of a risk a segment is, because even though covered conductor will almost always, not always, but almost always have a higher risk spend efficiency compared to underground, it only gets us a certain amount of risk reduction. And when we're talking about high consequence areas that if a fire were to start in, we could have significant consequences, that's where we start to look at the big picture of, okay, there's a risk spend efficiency number, there's also potential consequence of a fire, there's risk reduction, there's the ranking of the segment, there's feasibility analysis. So it's really a combination of things. And RSEs are an input into it, but it's not necessarily a direct, if there is an RSE higher than for this program than that, then we're going to allocate more funds to that. But we don't do that at this point.
Okay, so it's probably easier to, I think when we brought this up last time, I think Joe referred us to Appendix C1 RSE ranking. I don't know if you happen to have that handy.
Helping me out, Joe. Is this in the back of the chapter?
No, it's actually in the front. It's called C1 because it's in chapter ramp-C. So it's at the very beginning.
Ah, I see.
If
Can
you've
you
got
guys
the
still
whole,
see my screen? I have the
Yes.
I'm showing the ramp chapter.
Yeah, if you, no, not the wildfire ramp. Oh, you're
Oh,
only in
I see.
wildfire.
Yeah,
No,
I
this
only
is
have wildfire open. Okay.
yeah, no, we don't have that one readily available, Chris.
Okay, if I can do this, I have it in front of me. I could share this. I highlighted some things. So maybe we can do this. Let me see if I can share this and get the right.
Hopefully you have better luck than I did getting it loaded to share.
Well, we'll see. Well, this says Adobe Acrobat. We'll see if it's the right one here. Let's see. Does this say appendix? It's kind of small on mine. So does this say Appendix C1 at the top?
That is the one, yes.
Okay. All right. So then I highlighted at the top, which should be, let me see if I can make it a little bigger on mine.
And it looks like this is across chapters, right?
Yes, this is within RAMP, we're required to provide a table sorting RCs high to low. And so that's what this is. Chris may have yeah, if you look at the RCs look to be sorted high to low on this one.
Okay. And
across chapters.
Okay. And then if I look at the top line 2, it talks about PSPS sectionalizing tier 3. Line 5, which is highlighted, is PSPS sectionalizing tier 2. Total cost 0.54. So the $M, how much is this in actual dollars? 0.54?
Very
Yeah,
small.
0.54 million, $540,000.
540,000. Okay. And then these show high RSCs because these are in order apparently of RSC. Yeah. So what I'm curious is are these programs going to be, one of the questions we had from the last workshop was to understand miles and in terms of implementation. And I don't know if that's units that you use, but from today's discussion, you gave us some context for, you're going to be covered conductors on this over the near term. This is over the next 10 years. And then you got so many miles afterwards. Is this sectionalizing control mitigation? Does this show up in a number of miles, like all miles that can be done are going to be sectionalized? I mean, this shows a very high RSC and a relatively low cost.
This is by number of sectionalizing devices installed. And what this program does is it's looking at where are the people most affected by PSPS events in our system, and then looking at, can we install additional sectionalizing devices to separate the the areas with the more extreme weather as opposed to some of the other areas in order to minimize the number of people that are shut off should there be a PSPS event. We had a really good example. We have a particular area of our service territory on one of our circuits called Hellhole Canyon, and that one experiences very high winds. And where the sectionalizing device was previously, in order to de-energize the area in Hellhole Canyon, you had to go further back and de-energize other customers as well. But by installing a sectionalizing device very close to that park area, we're able to now only de-energize 30 customers that are right there where the most extreme wind areas are during a PSPS event, leaving the rest of the circuit energized in those sorts of events. And so that's how we scoped some of these things and how we came to those determinations and why we use the units of number of sectionalizing devices installed.
So I think you were explaining that these were all already installed. These are all Or are you saying that this is?
Oh, this is a program we've been doing and we will continue to do. Yes.
Okay. So is this, is it laid out how many more sectionalizing devices and how many more miles of circuit are going to be done over the near term and the long term, and how many can be done?
Well, we have it scoped for ramp. And again, the units would be in our work paper.
Yeah, I'll double check this, but I believe it's 10 a
here it
year,
is.
10 or 20 a year.
Yes. So we're looking at, yeah, the low was 9 and the high was 11. So yeah, 10 per year in 22, 23, and 24.
And how many would be done if you were going to do it in for all the circuits that that you would be able to reduce the impacts of PSPS on them? 10 or
I think that's
a year out of how many?
Oh, out of how many circuits experience PSPS events? Our number of circuits impacted by PSPS varies from year to year. I think somewhere in the order of 50 or so circuits have been impacted, but we could have sectionalizing. We can install multiple sectionalizing devices on one single circuit, and so it's not a true, one-to-one relationship there. You can put multiple sectionalizing devices on one circuit if that would help.
Yeah, and sometimes, Chris, it goes hand in hand with the grid hardening. So as the engineering team is scoping where we might want to underground certain areas, they might say, hey, this might be a good place to also add a switch so we can isolate now what is going to be an underground portion of a segment that should not be impacted by PSPS anymore. So it really goes hand in hand, and we don't have a 10-year objective if you're looking for that for sectionalizing, because it's sort of done on a case-by-case basis to figure out where they need to go in the near term. We can't project weather changes or system changes in 10 years to figure that out. We can do it a little bit more with grid hardening because we have tangible miles we're trying to mitigate.
So I think part of our question had to do with how, SEMPRA is gathering this data, or SDG&E is gathering this data and then targeting this stuff. So I understand that, you're doing 10 a year. You also mentioned that you might be doing this hand in hand with wildfire mitigation, and I can understand there could be some work that might be more efficient if they were performed at the same time. I guess our concern is this is your numbers have shown this to be a very high RSE, so a great risk reduction for the cost. And PSPS has a large impact. I'm not sure, I guess I don't have a good understanding of how. I understand the example of where you went in and you installed circuits and reduced the need to do impact customers, but PSPS has a huge impact on customers in many ways that I'm not sure that that information is being captured. There's the medical baseline, there's the access and functional needs, there's the elderly, there's the critical infrastructure, there's folks who are on wells. Some folks, if they're elderly, they may have to evacuate, even if they don't have a wildfire, just because they can't, just because of the stress of being without power. There's a lot of impacts that PSPS has on folks, and it's not clear to me how SDG&E is gathering and targeting those customers, and then for such a mitigation that has such a high RSE, maybe expediting that. Sure, it could be done maybe a little more efficiently when wildfire work is going to be done in the same area, but is there value in seeing more of this in the ramp, more of the units that are being done, and expediting this relative to 10 units a year? I'm just kind of asking that because I don't really understand at this point how SDG comes up with this number, 10 units a year, and not 100 units a year, or something very different. I don't understand that process.
Yeah, so let me try to break that down a little bit. I think we can only sectionalize so much, right? It goes hand in hand with where the weather stations are, how we think we're going to operate PSPS. So if we look at this and see a high RSE in the thousands, maybe a quick assumption is, hey, maybe we should put all our money there and just put a bunch of sectionalizing. But that also means our sole mitigation is going to become PSPS, and that's not really our objective. So PSPS is a component, and there's also other things we're doing for all those types of customers. There's the generator programs, there's the hardening programs that are helping mitigate the impacts for those customers, and we do look at the PSPS risk as a component of the overall assessment. So when you're looking at the RSE here, it's actually a combination of fire risk reduction and PSPS risk reduction. In the PSPS sectionalizing case, PSPS sectionalizing doesn't mitigate fire risk, it only mitigates PSPS impacts. But overall, across the assessment, we're looking at both, and we are looking at critical customers and their needs, and we're continuing to refine that model. Go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, Sarah, you captured almost all of it. I was just going to mention that the sectionalizing devices without additional weather information or more weather stations is also a limiting factor. And then just to note, because we are being targeted and because we are targeting those customers that have experienced multiple PSPS events with these mitigations, it's why the RSE is so high. If we were to do more of these and target customers who maybe don't see as many, the RSE would drop significantly. So it's kind of, it's just part of the balance of all of our mitigations that we need to take into account.
Okay, and this balancing is not like this is kind of like a judgment type of a thing, I take it. There's no real like formula for this to say, we are going to do 10 a year. We're balancing with others, but there's no like formula that says this is how we came up with this level or something like that.
No, not directly. And again, there's, like we mentioned before, there's no, in this case, there's no real alternative to this mitigation, right? I mean, if we want to save customers from PSPS by sectionalizing, this is kind of the only way to do it. And so it's a little different from like the grid hardening initiatives where maybe you have multiple ways of reducing wildfire risk along the circuit. And so, we're looking at our historical numbers where we've been able to put PSPS sectionalizing devices, the types and numbers of customers that have been impacted, and where we can actually make a difference by installing these sectionalizing devices. Because again, if you don't put them in the right place, or you put them everywhere, it doesn't really target the customers that could be impacted by PSPS. You'll just end up opening more devices during an event instead of really getting the value that you want.
So when you are looking at the types and numbers of customers, is that like in a work paper, or that talks about these types and numbers of customers so that we have a sense of what that is?
Let me double check, Chris, if we do have a breakdown of that.
I think the customers were just broken up by tier 3 and tier 2, not by other types such as critical, and those sorts of things.
Yeah, but when you look at the RSE work papers, Chris, for example, let me see if I can pull this up real quick here, but for PSPS sectionalizing, you'll see the different types of customers that are estimated to be mitigated by the PSPS sectionalizers, and they have different weights. So critical customers are weighed more heavily than others, and so there's bigger benefit for those. Trying to see if I can find this. Yep, right here. Let me know when you can see it. Thinking. Can you see that, Chris? Okay. Yeah, so this is an example for PSPS sectionalizing tier 3. We actually broke down an estimate of how many residential, industrial, commercials could see a reduced impact from PSPS by installing these switches, how many essential, how many urgent, medical baseline. This breakdown is applied across the board for any mitigation that has a PSPS reduction benefit. The generator programs will have those, the microgrids will have those, and we are continuing to refine this framework of how we break this down. But at a minimum, we are including a weighting factor to take into account critical customers and medical baseline customers.
So just so I understand it, this describes 141 medical baseline customers. Out of a total of 1,600 or so customers?
17, yeah, 1,700 in tier 3.
Okay. Oh, okay, I see.
Yeah.
Okay, so it sounds like at the moment it's in terms of defining what types of customers or what kind of customers, is it, well, you also show, is it like one essential customer?
Yeah. So we have a general, maybe a general idea of where we think these devices might go. And so based on their location, we're able to look into the different types of customers that are downstream of those devices that would benefit from them. Some of it might be extrapolating, like if we know an estimate roughly of the breakdown for a given year, we might estimate that for the later years and then refine those as we go. But that's generally the idea, is for by installing, I can't remember the exact number for tier 3, but that number of sectionalizing devices, we would mitigate or reduce the impacts of PSPS to one essential customer, 141 medical baseline customers that have registered themselves in our system and are flagged as medical baseline, and a total of 1,500 other types of customers that range between residential, industrial, and commercial.
Okay, and this doesn't get down to the level of access functional needs customers, AFN customers, or cell towers, or customers on.
So I believe cell towers, water, that type of critical infrastructure would fall, I think, under essential. Urgent, if I'm remembering it correctly, and I'll provide some definitions maybe after this, but I think urgent includes things like hospitals and fire stations. AFN is a category that we're working on defining a little bit better, so we don't have that explicitly broken down yet, but we are working on developing a more robust framework, even to break out residential, industrial, commercial, because you could argue they have different levels of impact potentially. So AFN is something that we're going to be looking at closely and prioritizing to better define this.
Okay.
So this is Dave Van Dyken at CPUC. I just have a quick question on what you were just talking about here. So you're showing this here shows, you know, how many customers may still be affected once you install, you know, the appropriate number of circuit interrupters, right? Does this then go into how you determine where you want to prioritize your system hardening?
So the way we've done this, at least for the PSPS sectionalizing devices, is we're looking across the system and we're looking to identify those areas that get impacted the most. And then also sometimes, just as we're scoping grid hardening initiatives, we might come across good candidates or areas where it makes sense to put in a switch. So this analysis sort of came after we identified, hey, I think, you know, adding 10 switches a year, for example, seems like a good target for us just based on the circuits we're looking at in general. And then for those switches, we start to dive into, well, how many customers are going to benefit from it and what's the risk spend efficiency for that? So it's a little bit kind of the opposite of what you described. Does that answer your question?
I think it does. I'm looking here. So I'm looking for, like, you know, how to you know, alleviate the impact to as many customers as possible, you know, of PSPS events. So, you know, I was looking to see, like, and of course you guys still have, you guys have the, you know, the data generator programs and, you know, all that kind of stuff too. So yeah, I just wanted to see, like, you know, once you know, all the I forget the term you use. I'm sorry, PSPS circuit
Sectionalizing devices, or
yeah,
PSPS?
thank you. Yeah, cycling devices, like, you know, what, you know, of the customers that are still, you know, in a heightened risk of PSPS, you know, what level of hardening is going on in that area. So, okay.
Hey team, this is Joe again, and sorry to interrupt, but I do need to FYI, Sarah's still looking strong, appreciate it. But
Can I
our other team members have to drop off because of other commitments at 3:30. So I just wanted to mention that.
Joe, this is Steve Hayner from SPD. Can I ask
Yeah.
one final question?
Go ahead, Steve.
For anyone on your team, can you make any type of a blanket statement as to whether or not the recloser settings would need to be changed as a result of the presence of a sectionalizer?
Jonathan, can you take that one? I don't know if Sean is still there.
Yeah, I'm still here.
Generally,
Oh, go ahead, Jonathan.
yeah, generally not, right? So it depends, right? So we have system protection settings at the substation. So the substation settings would change in order to accommodate the additional switch, right? Because the switches or the sectionalizing devices come with devices that we set for protection, right? So we have settings adjustments that go with the new sectionalizing device. So then everything upstream of that is also adjusted, as well as the substation, adjusted to accommodate it, but not drastically. The new device, or the sectionalizing device, is also adjusted to fit the characteristics of the circuit and where it's placed, so the location. So generally what we have is, if you have a cascade of devices, you want to set the protection settings so that the device that's closest to the fault is the one that trips, right, first, and doesn't spread. The interruption of power doesn't spread to the rest of the circuit. That's just kind of a general guidance there. So short answer, there are some general settings changes, but not drastic to the overall wildfire protection.
Okay. Second, the follow-up question to that is, in those instances where there are changes to the recloser settings, would the resulting settings result in a higher potential incidence of fires or electrocutions as a result of those changes up on sections upstream of the recloser, of the sectionalizer?
Right, and the answer is no additional risk or higher risk associated with adding a sectionalizing device. In a way, it could enhance it, right? It just depends on the type of fault, and because you have a device brought closer to the fault, you could potentially have it, have better protection. But it just depends on the characteristics of the fault and just the incident type.
Okay, thank you.
I know we're at time, but maybe I could ask you quickly, Sarah. I mean, you were explaining, and Sean, that you know, you're looking at wildfire mitigation, you're looking to not use PSPS. But you are still going to be looking at PSPS as a necessary mitigation for quite some time, correct? Because it looks like you were saying earlier that even after 2031, you have 1,700 more distribution miles to harden. So PSPS is going to be a mitigation measure for, I guess, decades. Is that correct? It's not like you're going to be able to do something and then you don't anticipate not needing to call PSPS. Is that true?
Yeah, the long-term objective, Chris, and why part of the reason we're ramping up our grid hardening efforts, is to really try to mitigate both fire risk and the need for PSPS. The reality is the weather continues to change, climate continues to change. To your point, there's still areas that will remain unmitigated. It's going to take us some time to really strengthen the system to reduce the need for PSPS. So PSPS will continue to be a last resort, as it always has, but we are looking to reduce it in the long run.
Okay, thank you. So we covered not everything, but I covered a lot that I wanted to be sure to ask. I won't. I'll leave it at that. I don't know if others have something to say or if you're planning to wrap it up, but I just wanted to give others an opportunity to. But I appreciate all the information that all of you have answered a number of questions. Thank you very much.
Yep, happy to do it. Thank you for the opportunity.
All right, thanks, Chris. And as he said, opportunity for other folks to, if there's any questions, if you will, last round of questions folks would like to ask before we do wrap it up. I do not see any hands. Just a reminder that we have a workshop tomorrow, same time, same place. I think a different log on, but still 1 o'clock, 3 o'clock tomorrow. And the topics for tomorrow are EII and cyber. The idea is that the first hour would be EII, go over RSE calculations similar to what we've done in the past with the other risk chapters, and similar with cyber as well. And so if there are no, I'm looking, no additional questions today, certainly appreciate the discussion. Chris, good discussions. Definitely appreciate you letting us know the questions ahead of time. That really does help us do some research. And to the extent many of you will be joining tomorrow, 1 o'clock, we'll see you then. Thanks so much. Stay safe.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.